Friends, let's get started with this Knit Introduction 101 Basics course, so to speak. Now, I will say from the outset that I'm going to be talking to you as if you are completely new at sewing. So if you have already been doing sewing for a while and you kind of know the basics, you might just want to hit the click button through until you find something that you need to learn about. But I'm going to start the very, very basics because my mission here on Instagram is to bring the lost art of sewing back to the modern woman. Hence my name, Bringing Sewing Back. That's my mission here. I want to teach someone who has absolutely no earthly idea about sewing how to sew. And I'm going to give my whole tips and tricks and things I've learned over the last few years with sewing. And today we're going to be starting with knits. So what the heck is knit fabric? Well, unlike woven fabric, which has no stretch at all to the fabric, knit is going to have stretch to it. Typically that's through adding in spandex, and knits can either have two-way stretch or four-way stretch. So two-way stretch would be that it's mainly stretchy one way. See how this is super stretchy one way? The other way, there is a little bit of stretch, but not much. So this would typically be like a two-way fabric. Two-way stretch. There's also four-way stretch fabric. That's typically with like athletic fabric or swim fabric, and that's going to have great stretch both ways. So what you need to do is determine what fabric is suitable for the pattern that you are using. Most patterns out there on the market will tell you if you need two-way or four-way, and they will also tell you the percentage of stretch. So whether you need 25%, 50%, etc. And you can figure that out. So one of the easiest way to figure out how much stretch is in a fabric is to cut a 10-inch strip, lay that down on a cutting mat that has a ruler on it, or just lay it right next to a ruler, and you stretch out and you see how far it stretches before it starts to feel like it's too tight. So if it's 10 inches to start with and it stretches to 12.5 inches, that's going to be a 25% stretch. If it's 10 inches and it stretches to 15 inches, that's going to be a 50% stretch. So it's a super easy calculation. You just figure out how much it has. I'll pause and say that there is some woven fabric that can have some stretch to it. So it's not as clean to say knit fabric is stretchy fabric and woven fabric is not stretchy, because there can be woven fabric that stretches, but for simplicity's sake, that's how I'm referring to it today. To determine what fabric you are going to be using for the pattern that you are sewing up, you need to just determine what you are going to use to construct the garment. Are you going to use a sewing machine, or are you going to use a serger, or are you going to use a combination of the two? Really, this is based on your preference. I'm speaking to someone who I think is brand new in sewing. So I would venture to assume that most of you only have a sewing machine and have not taken the steps to invest in a serger. A serger is a wonderful machine to have when you're sewing knits, especially, and I absolutely love my serger, but I started sewing knits on a sewing machine. I kind of view the serger as like what you would invest in once you really determine that you love sewing, because they're not cheap, you know, it's a pretty penny to invest in that machine. So today I'm mainly going to be focusing on tips and techniques for using a sewing machine with knits, but I will also show you my serger as well. Now, whenever I sit down to my sewing machine, I kind of in my head go through 5 things before I ever start sewing. The first thing is, what thread am I using and what color? The second thing is, what tensions am I using? The third thing is, what needle am I using? The fourth thing is, what foot am I using? And the fifth thing is, what stitch and stitch length am I using? So let's start at the top one. So the first thing with thread is you want to think through color. So what color do you want the thread to be? Do you want it to match your garment, or do you want it to have a contrasting color? I typically match my garments, but you can definitely use thread as a design detail by using a contrasting color on the. Once you determine the color of your thread, you need to determine what type of thread you use. Typically, there's cotton or there's polyester. I always go with polyester when I'm sewing with knits, because polyester thread will not shrink as much as cotton thread would shrink. You don't want your thread to shrink, because then when you pull the garment to try to put it on, it's going to pop the stitches. So if you're just going to use a basic like zigzag or a different type of stitch like that, the lightning bolt, you'll want to use regular polyester thread. Now, there are stretchy threads that allow you to sew a straight stitch but have it be stretchy. That is the Seriflex thread from Metler, which I adore, or the Elo Flex from Hobby Lobby, which is good, not as good as this, but I do like it. I will talk more about these once we get to step 5, which is your stitch and stitch length. So in general, you're going to use a polyester thread unless you want to get fancy with these. Step 2 is the tension. What tension are you going to use on your machine? I'm going to be very honest, and I may be in the minority here. I don't know. Fill me in with what you do. I don't really change my tension all that often. Depending on what machine you have and what things are loaded into your machine, sometimes your machine will automatically change the tension, which I do believe my Bernina 435 does for me. So I don't play around with it much unless I'm shearing. But you do want to consider that. I would recommend looking at your manual and see what tension and what settings they recommend for a certain stitch that you're going to be using and a certain fabric you're going to be using. Your manual will be your, quote unquote Bible for sewing. So always refer back to that first thing. So the third thing is, what needle are you going to be using? You want to use a needle that is specifically designed to work with knits. Now, I will say that your universal needle is supposed to be able to work on both woven and knit fabric, and I have been able to get away with using this. So if this is all you have access to, you'll be fine. You might notice there might be a few skip stitches, but universal needles are supposed to be able to work for knits. What I find, though, that works the best is a ballpoint needle. So there's a bunch of different names out on the market. So I'm just going to pop through some of the ones that I use. So if you go to the store and you see ballpoint needle, that would be one that's specifically for knits. Also red tip needle, that's for knits, as well as stretch. That's for knits as well. There's other wording, but I think if you go and you pick this up at the store, it's going to come with like a little piece of cardboard on it with some instructions. Just look back there and make sure it is designed for knit fabric. Don't mind the Free Willy in the background for my kids. So the fourth thing is, what foot are you going to be using? So every machine is going to come with just the basic standard foot, which you can use for sewing knits. This is not ideal, but it can work, and I will show you ways to help as you use this foot if this is all you have access to. However, a walking foot, there we go, is going to be your absolute best friend when it comes to sewing knit fabric. What a walking foot does is it walks across the fabric as you're sewing so that it does not pull the fabric as you're sewing. This foot is going to stay on the fabric as you're sewing, and what that does is it typically can cause a little bit of tension, stretching out the fabric. I will show you a tip and a trick of how to fix issues that come with sewing with this if you do have that. The walking foot can be affordable. It can also be expensive depending on what sewing machine you have. So some of the standard sewing machines you get from like Hobby Lobby or Joann's, they're going to be pretty affordable. I've seen them go for like $25 to $40. If you have different types of machine like a Bernina, it's probably going to be more expensive. So I would just look at your budget, see what you can afford. If you can afford it, I would definitely recommend getting it. If you can't, I'm going to show you what you can do to make sewing with this foot a little bit easier. Okay, so step 5, again, sorry for the background noise. Step 5, when it comes to what stitch and what stitch length you're going to be using, that's when things get a little bit tricky. So there are different stitches that I would recommend for the constructing of the garment, and there are different stitches that I would recommend for the top stitching of the garment. So I'm just going to start with the constructing, and I'm going to go through stitch length, what type of stitch, and then what thread to use with that as well. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of all the different stitches, I'll go back to these two threads. These are those stretchy threads, the Seraflex from Metler and the Eloflex from, I don't know the actual company, Coates Eloflex. I found it at Hobby Lobby. These are stretchy thread, which means you can actually sew a straight stitch. So if you are wanting to sew only a straight stitch, or maybe your machine only offers a straight stitch, this is when these would really come in handy. I would recommend going ahead and investing in those. Otherwise, if you're just using your regular polyester thread, you will not be able to sew a straight stitch on knit garment, because when you then go to stretch the garment to get on, your stitches are going to pop. You're going to need to do with your regular polyester thread is use a stretchy stitch. So there are a bunch of different options. Every option I'm about to say next is going to be constructed with just regular polyester thread. The first one is the most typical one you're going to see people use, which is a zigzag stitch. It basically just looks like a zigzag, and it is stretchy, so it's going to stretch with the fabric as you go. There are some upsides and some downsides to this. The upside is this is on typically every machine I've ever seen on the market, so it's really accessible, and it's pretty compact and condensed, and it stretches really great with the fabric. The downside is that when you're sewing a seam with this, it's not going to look like a flat seam where a straight stitch would make it look. It's instead going to look like there's little divots in the seam line. So it just depends on what kind of look you're going for. Similar to the zigzag stitch, and in my opinion, what is better, a better alternative is the lightning bolt stitch. It also is a zigzag stitch, but as you can see, it is a lot more condensed and it looks almost as if it's a straight line with just a little stuff jutting out to the side. This one is ideal in comparison to the zigzag simply because you won't have these little divots in between each stitch point, which will make it look like a more flawless straight line. I would say the majority of people who sew knits with a sewing machine use the lightning bolt stitch. Another stitch that I found though that I like is the overlock stitch. It basically mimics what a serger stitch would look like. So it has a straight line at the seam line, which will give it a really flawless look. And then it also finishes off the edge of the fabric so that it kind of appears to have more of a serged look, and it is stretchy because of the zigzag in between. So this is also a great option, but it doesn't come on every machine. My favorite stitch that I have just recently discovered is the triple straight stitch. So what the triple straight stitch is it's a straight stitch that stretches. What? Mind blown. I did not know this until recently, but basically what it does is the stitch goes back and forth over the fabric as it progresses, which allows the thread, to stretch. So it basically looks just like a straight stitch. It's very durable because each portion of your fabric has been gone over a few times, and it's on most machines. So I would check your manual, see if you have a triple straight stitch. If you do, I would 100% recommend going with that one. So one last top stitching option that I would like to mention for knits is using a twin needle. Now these are amazing in the sense that you can get a faux cover stitch simply by using your sewing machine and using this twin needle. It functions the same way as a cover stitch does. However, it's not as great on the underside of the fabric. So if you were to pull up your hem, it wouldn't look the same as a cover stitch machine. And also these can be really finicky on a sewing machine. On my particular Benina 435, I have been able to get it to work, but not great. So these only cost a few bucks. I would say it's worth giving it a shot, but you may have to play around with your tension and settings in order to get a clean look. Last thing that I will mention about something that's helpful for hemming up and top stitching knits and also will help with stabilizing for a twin needle is this Sew Keys knit stay tape. I have it from the brand Sew Keys. There's other brands out there, but I really enjoyed this one. You can buy it off Amazon. I have the 1/2 inch and the 1 inch, and I kind of use these for pretty much all hems. What it does is it irons on to the underside of a hem before you hem it up, and it allows the hem to stay in place and stabilize it for in case you're using, a twin needle or some sort of top stitching. And it helps you keep the same seam allowance all the way through because there's a guide for where you fold it up. I use these pretty much on every single knit project, so I go through it pretty quickly, but it lasts for forever, as you can see. Amazon, pretty affordable. Highly, highly, highly recommend. It will help a lot with knits, hemming them up. I will be using this one on the veil tutorial, so if you want to see this in action, check out my veil tutorial highlight. Okay, last thing I'm going to do, because I am a visual learner and I can only assume that some of you guys are too, so I know telling you something is maybe not as helpful as showing you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a piece of fabric and I'm going to sew the same stitch with a walking foot and the same stitch without a walking foot. And I'm going to show you what the difference looks like, and I'm also going to show you the difference between each different stitch type. And then I'll show you a tip for what I do to help shrink back seams that get stretched out using a regular foot. So these are the 4 constructing stitches that I mentioned earlier: your regular zigzag, the lightning bolt, the overlock stitch, and the triple straight stitch. So for the zigzag, that's what it's going to look like on the inside. It's got great stretch to it, and this is what it's going to look like from the outside. As you can see, there are spaces between each stitch, which creates kind of like a divot between it, but it's fine. The one that I prefer more than the zigzag is the lightning bolt stitch. That one looks pretty darn good, pretty much like a straight stitch, and it also is pretty stretchy. This one takes forever to sew though, because the amount of zigzag is really small. So just to do this, it took like a minute and a half or 2 minutes even. This one is the overlock stitch. This is what mimics a serger, and from the outside, I think it looks really beautiful. It also finishes off the edge. And then this is my favorite, the triple straight stitch. It's not as stretchy, but even though it's not as stretchy, it still has a lot of stretch to it. And look how beautiful that finish is. I mean, it's basically just a straight line, but it stretches and it's super durable. So this one is my favorite of all the 3. All the ones that I just showed you were completed with a walking foot. This one was completed with a regular foot. And do you see how it's wavy here? So when you open up, the seam is not going to seam as flat. You see all these waves in it? So this is what's going to happen if you use a regular foot. Maybe. A lot of times it'll stretch the fabric as you're sewing, which will create these kind of waves in it. The simple, easy fix is to take your iron, okay? Make sure that the steam setting is on, and make sure the heat is to whatever the fabric content is. This is a polyester, so I have my heat here set to a polyester. And all you're going to do is you're going to put it over the fabric, not touching it, just about an inch away from the fabric, and you're going to let that steam hit the fabric, and it's going to shrink it back into place. You see how those waves are going away? So I'm just going to do that again, and then I'm actually going to iron over it. After you go over it a couple times, look at that. It went right back into place, and now it's a straight seam. So all you got to do is, if it gets stretched out while you're sewing, simply steam it with your iron, and you'll be good to go. I think that's everything I wanted to share about knits that I can remember. So if there's anything else that comes up, or any other tips that you have, if you're an advanced sewist and you want to share, send them to me and I'll post them up here and keep them saved to the highlight.